now I want to emphasize an aspect of citizenship that is, although as old as the hills, newly controversial, or at least more openly controversial than it's ever been. And that's the aspect of patriotism. It's not well thought of these days, at least in America. Sometimes, and I've heard about Israel too, sometimes that is because certain people, particularly intellectuals, hold opinions so far abstracted from the concrete conditions of life that they cleverly start sawing off the branch they're perched on. But more often it happens by reason of people's decent-minded but woolly confusion between patriotism, the love of one's country, and chauvinism, its fanatical perversion. America has, as I mentioned, a sort of secondary national anthem, probably because not even the most ardent patriot can summon much musical appreciation for our primary one, the Star-Spangled Banner, practically unsingable. That secondary anthem is called America the Beautiful. It begins as an ode to the beauty of the continent, from sea to shining sea. But its second stanza ends like this: America, America, God mend thine every flaw, confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty in law. These verses express my idea of patriotism, a sensory eye for the beauty of the land and a moral eye for the flaws to be mended and the selves to be controlled. My point is that well-formed citizenship has a moral side, of course, but that such moral rectitude works most gracefully and most effectively as an outflow of heartfelt loyalty to the land, to its stories and its people. Thus, although its activity is centrally rational, deliberative, critical, political, one aspect of citizenship is surely attachment to, or to put it plainly, love of country. The educational implication of that affective feature, that emotional feature, is that citizens, especially future ones, should get what used to be called a sentimental education. Their sensibilities, their sensory and imaginative capacities should be attuned to this, their particular land. Because that stocking of the imagination happens mostly in childhood, though new immigrants can catch up. Higher education is involved indirectly, though vitally. For the teachers themselves are taught in the institutions of higher education, are taught in the institutions of higher education, especially in departments or schools of education. It seems to me that patriotism ought to be a major issue for reflection in those institutions. The teachers of teachers should ponder whether it should be taught and how. When I was a child, I went for my first year to a German public school, or rather what's called in German a Volksschule. Now, public and folk are as far apart in connotation as are the Publius of the Federalists and the Führer of the Nazis. We were taught a vaporous and in retrospect repulsive subject called Heimatkunde, whose bullying sentimental mystification has happily no English translation, and I hope no Hebrew one either. Tidings of the homeland, I guess, would do it. What, I ask myself, is so wrong with such state-mandated love of one's own? It is, I think, that it is forcibly symbolic, willfully ideological. It envelops archaeological remains, monuments, landscapes in a fog of state intention that obscures the spontaneous warmth of particularity, the concreteness which induces sound imaginativeness. Israel, whose premier history book is the Bible, and whose land is indefeasibly beautiful, wouldn't, I should think, need and shouldn't tolerate that kind of indoctrination. After all, even an occasional visitor like myself, whose heart is ultimately somewhere else, is sometimes suddenly seized, for instance, when up on the heights of Mount Gilboa above my family's main kibbutz, by the recognition, and it comes on a soul like a fragrance, that this is the Holy Land, a place of incomparable eventfulness, such as has captured the soul's attention from way back. So I'm slowly and cautiously, with a sense of incompetence, working myself into the crux of the topic, the role of higher education in a Jewish state, which I've taken to mean implicitly the education of Jewish citizens on a level above the acculturation of children and of immigrants, because that is more a matter of training than education. I'm assuming a lot here, namely that Israel is and ought to be a Jewish state. In fact, as I've said, I'm very aware of being simply an outsider, not quite legitimately joining one side of the great debate agitating your country. To my insufficiently informed mind, a non-Jewish Israel does not seem to be just a Mediterranean anomaly and a non-necessity among nation states. But perhaps the less side-taking by me on this issue, the better, except to admit that I've surely been permanently dyed by the Nazi-induced defensive Zionism of my childhood. That said, here, in sum, is the way I've tried to put the problem tonight. First, isn't Jewish citizenship a contradiction in terms? For my Madisonian model for citizenship in a democratic republic, that is, in a modern liberal state, is one in which there is minimal ethnicity or religion in the public sphere and none in government. And I'm supposing that in Israel, Jewishness is in fact a fusion both of peoplehood and of religious tradition. In such a liberal state, there are matters for the private sphere with its mediating association and citizens, whatever their personal origin or faith, bring themselves somehow to rejoice in the multiplicity of competing spiritual possibilities, or at least to tolerate publicly what they can't join in privately. Under this notion of political freedom, a Jewish citizen in a country that also has a rapidly growing number of fully entitled Arabic citizens is problematic, something you all know more intimately than I do. How might institutions of higher education deal with this problem? Such an answer as I have may seem insufferably vapid to you, but to me it seems potent. The business of higher education, which employs older people more advanced in studies to teach mostly young adults about to come on the national scene, sometimes as teachers in their turn. The business of this enterprise is both universal and particular. Its universal business is thoughtful learning, which ought to obey one and the same set of intellectual criteria in any university or college anywhere. The particular business is to address local conditions, to apply thoughtful learning to its own people's problems. The description may not be news to anyone, but I mean by thoughtful learning, what I do mean by thoughtful learning, however, that might seem offbeat, though I think of it as more truly mainstream than the conventional goings-on. Learning, as a noun, can mean a fait accompli, a condition already acquired. I, however, am thinking of an ever incomplete activity, which is neither the acquisition of ever narrower scholarship, nor the processing of heaps of information. It is rather an effort. The effort is made sometimes on one's own, using experiences reflectively reviewed and helped by teaching taken to heart. But at other times, it is carried on in company, by listening carefully and talking candidly. It is an effort, first of all, directed to framing wide and deep questions. And by thoughtfulness, I mean not the construction of trend-setting concepts or the devising of winning polemical stratagems, but an effort to get somewhere near the bottom, somewhere near the truth of things. In fact, I see that I've talked myself into identifying learning with thinking, and I could have used just one word for the other. Now, those of you who've undergone a higher education, particularly in Israel, will know, so I'm told, that this kind of learning does not describe the way of a dyed-in-the-wool, a really professorial professor who speaks with professorial authority, and in the case of the humanities at least, has acquired or is even distinguished by personal doctrines. So here is the sum total of what I have to offer concerning what is, it seems, the problem of higher education in a Jewish state, which is, after all, just a subset of the global problem that faces this modern democracy, and that is also ethnically and religiously Jewish, or for that matter, that faces the Arabic and Islamic nations. For won't they too, if belatedly and aggravatedly, have to confront the same problem? To me, it is thinkable that in a generation, thoughtful Jews and Muslims might hold congresses to work out together the common deep theory of a modified modernity by which Enlightenment universalism comes to terms with traditional specificity. Anyhow, what I've been getting at and want to urge on you is that academic structures and curricular programs should perhaps not precede, but follow the design of a teaching mode. What is sometimes called an institutional culture might then be brought into being, which supports a non-professorial way of teaching. Such a way might help to mediate what in the normal academic style is bound to generate entrenched parties that throw a noisy cover of contention over what is, after all, perhaps really a tragic situation in the Greek sense, an insoluble antagonism built into the human condition that must nonetheless be resolved by some sort of novel, practical wisdom. Here is how I imagine such a corps of teachers. They would certainly have deep attachments to their country. When I went to school in Brooklyn, New York, in the 40s of the last century, we still had classes in civics, that is, in citizenship, and I think that's all gone now. There we read a moving story that I've never forgotten, which is called The Man Without a Country, in which some lines by Sir Walter Scott are spoken by a man, a young naval officer, who had, in effect, impulsively thrown his country away. And he says, or he quotes, "Breathes there a man with a soul so dead, who never to himself has said, 'This is my own, my native land,' where here in Israel, as in America, one's land can be native by natural birth or by deliberate adoption. As Lincoln says of America, you become, and I quote, 'blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the founding ancestors,' if you willingly absorb the moral sentiments of the Declaration of Independence." He said that in Chicago in 1858. I imagine these teachers of mine to have a deep feeling for their land and consequently a fine decency in their vigorous, even agonized pursuit of its perplexities. They won't be inclined to publish manifestos or to parade their sentiments, but their students will understand them well enough. It will follow that as they are tacit models of Jewish Israelis, they will be teachers, by example, of a suitable rhetoric, a suitable way of speaking. They won't talk the jargon of the intellectual marketplace, but use a language that is personal and common, a language that follows naturally from being thoughtful. And when their students try fancy speech, they look at them skeptically and ask them to translate their own thinking into their own Hebrew, which will then be apt to be a much more natural and vigorous language. Third, they'll be perfectly egalitarian, not because of an ideology, but because, in the phrase of our own rebel philosopher Spinoza, viewed sub specie aeternitatis, as he says, that is, seen from the aspect of eternity, the differences between us are small, and we are all in it, that is, in the search of a way together. These teachers will be close to their students, though not as uneasy pals or as premature friends, but as respectful collaborators in a vitally important search, be it for a theoretical solution or for a practical accommodation, that those so educated can live with and carry forth with exemplary conviction and with suitable modesty. In sum, I, an engaged outsider, have no theoretical solution to the deep dilemma of Jewish citizenship, but only a suggestion about one way to live with it as an uncircumventable fact. Bring up good teachers. And I can even give their specific goodness a name. I would call it reflection grounded in reverence. Thank you.